Your Honor, I would like to address the defendant's apparent costume. The words cut through the stale air of courtroom, 4B like a blade drawn slow across skin. Nathan Whitfield stood at the prosecution table in a three-piece suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, silver cufflinks catching the flicker of a dying fluorescent tube overhead. He gestured toward the defendant's table with the casual contempt of a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. Elias Thorne did not move. He stood where the bailiff had positioned him, wearing a corduroy jacket 2 sizes too large that someone had donated to the shelter on Cambridge Street. His silver beard had not seen a razor in weeks. His hands, weathered and scarred across the knuckles, hung loose at his sides. The only thing about him that seemed to belong in this room was the way he held himself. Spine straight, chin level, eyes forward. The courtroom was half empty on this Tuesday morning. A stenographer sat ready at her machine, fingers hovering. 3 other defendants waited on the hard wooden benches for their own cases, slumped in various postures of resignation. A woman in the back row held a phone at an angle that suggested she was recording, though no one had asked her to stop. Clara Mendez had covered the courthouse beat for 6 years, and she had learned that the most interesting moments rarely announce themselves in advance. Whitfield approached the defense table where a young public defender sat shuffling papers with the nervous energy of someone who had already lost. He pointed at the chain visible above Elias's collar. Those, Whitfield said, appear to be military dog tags. I would ask the court to note that the defendant is wearing what I can only assume are theatrical props designed to manipulate this proceeding. The public defender started to rise. Your Honor, my client is a veteran with documented service history, and this line of questioning is completely irrelevant to the trespassing charge before the court today. Judge Caroline Ashworth looked up from her papers. She had silver hair, pulled back severely, and reading glasses perched on her nose. 25 years on the federal bench had given her face the texture of someone who had heard every excuse and believed almost none of them. Counselor Whitfield, she said, perhaps you could stick to the matter at hand. Whitfield smiled the smile of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Of course, Your Honor. I merely wished to establish context. The defendant was found sleeping in the basement of a property owned by my client. When security personnel asked him to leave, he refused. He had to be physically removed. This is not the first time. Court records show 2 prior citations for trespassing. We are looking at a pattern of willful disregard for the property rights of others. He paused. Let the silence work. And I think it is worth noting, he continued, that every homeless individual in this city seems to have suddenly served in special forces. Remarkable how that works. Someone in the gallery shifted. The stenographer's fingers hesitated over her keys. Elias Thorne said nothing. Near the door that led to the holding area, Deputy Marshal Terrence Okafor stood with his hands clasped behind his back. He had worked this courthouse for 15 years. He had seen thousands of defendants pass through, wearing every expression from rage to defeat to hollow indifference. He had learned to read people the way a hunter reads tracks. This one was different. Okafor watched the old man's hands. They did not shake. They did not clench. They hung with the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that wasted movement could get you killed. When the judge addressed him directly, the old man's shoulders drew back by a fraction of an inch. Automatic, unconscious, the muscle memory of 10,000 formations. Okafor had served in Iraq from 2004 to 2006. Marine infantry. He knew that posture. He knew what it meant. Whitfield was still talking, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. He spoke about property values, about the responsibility of the court to send a message, about how people like the defendant exploited public sympathy and made a mockery of those who actually contributed to society. If you are watching this story unfold from wherever you are in the world, take a moment to let us know where you are joining from today. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. Stories like this one, about courage and sacrifice and the hidden heroes who walk among us unrecognized, they happen in every community, maybe even yours. You might pass someone on the street tomorrow who carries a weight you will never understand. If these stories speak to you, consider subscribing so you never miss one. Your support helps us share more of these incredible true accounts. Now, let us continue. The defendant, Whitfield said, gesturing dismissively, wants us to believe he is some kind of war hero, that those tags around his neck mean something. But I have seen no documentation, no proof, just a convenient costume worn by a man who would rather sleep in other people's basements than take responsibility for his own circumstances. Judge Ashworth removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She looked at Elias. "Mr. Thorne, do you have anything to say in response to these characterizations?" Elias lifted his eyes to meet hers. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, hoarse with disuse, the voice of a man who had not had anyone to talk to in a very long time. "No, Your Honor," he said. "I do not." Whitfield laughed. A short, sharp sound. "Of course not." He turned to address the gallery, playing to an audience of bored defendants and one recording journalist. "This is what we are dealing with," he announced. "A man who cannot even defend his own claims. A man who wears symbols he has no right to wear and expects the rest of us to carry him through life." Deputy Marshal Okafor's jaw tightened. His eyes moved from Whitfield's gesturing hands to the old man's forearm, where the sleeve of the donated jacket had ridden up slightly. He could not see clearly from this distance, but he thought he saw something there. Ink faded with age, lines that might have been an image. He took one step forward, then stopped himself. Not yet. But what Nathan Whitfield did not know, what no one in that courtroom understood, was that in exactly 43 minutes, he would be the one unable to speak. In 43 minutes, the most expensive suit in the room would mean nothing. In 43 minutes, a name would be spoken aloud that would change everything. And the man in the donated jacket, the man who had not defended himself, the man who had slept in basements and eaten from shelter kitchens and walked the streets of Boston like a ghost, that man would still be standing, the way he had always stood, waiting. The fluorescent light above the defense table buzzed and flickered, and for a moment Elias was not in the courtroom at all. He was 19 years old, standing on yellow footprints at Paris Island, a drill instructor's voice shredding the humid air while boys who thought they were men learned exactly how wrong they had been. He had enlisted 3 days after his 18th birthday. His father had called him a fool, said the military was for people who could not make anything of themselves in the real world, said Elias would wash out inside a month and come crawling back to Worcester with his tail between his legs. Elias had not crawled back. He had discovered something in those 13 weeks of boot camp that he had never known existed inside himself. A stillness at the center of chaos, an ability to slow his breathing, slow his heartbeat, slow the entire world down to a single point of focus while everything around him screamed and burned. The drill instructors noticed. They always noticed the ones who did not break. After infantry training, after his first deployment, after proving himself in ways that left scars both visible and invisible, the recruiters had come. Force reconnaissance, the tip of the spear. They needed men who could disappear into hostile territory for weeks at a time. Men who could wait motionless for days if the mission required it. Men who could make a single shot count from distances that seemed impossible. Elias had been all of those things. The courtroom sounds filtered back in slowly. Whitfield was conferring with his client's representative, a property manager in a cheap suit who kept checking his watch. The public defender was whispering something urgent, but Elias was not listening. His hand had moved without his permission to touch the outline of the dog tags beneath his shirt. 2 sets. His own, worn smooth by decades against his skin, and another pair that he had carried for 16 years. Tags that belonged to a dead man who still visited him in dreams. Vincent Sandoval had been 24 years old when they paired him with Elias as a spotter. Fresh out of Scout sniper school, eager and talented and absolutely certain that he was invincible. He had grown up in Albuquerque, the son of a mechanic and a school nurse, and he had a smile that could light up a room even in the worst forward operating bases in Afghanistan. He had also been obsessed with birds. Elias remembered the first time Vic had pulled out that battered field guide during a mission. They were in overwatch position on a ridge in Helmand Province, watching a village where a high-value target was supposedly meeting with Taliban commanders. 18 hours into a 24-hour surveillance rotation. Nothing moving below except goats and children. Vic had nudged him and pointed at a bird circling overhead. Upland buzzard. He had whispered, "Buteo hemalagius." You can tell by the wing pattern. Elias had told him to shut up and watch the village. But Vic had not shut up. He never did. Over the months that followed, during countless hours of waiting in positions that ranged from frozen mountain passes to sweltering desert heights, Vic had taught Elias more about birds than he had ever wanted to know. Hawks and eagles and falcons. The way they rode thermals. The way they could spot prey from impossible heights. The way they struck without warning. That was how Elias got his call sign. It happened during a mission in 2007. A Taliban commander had been coordinating attacks on coalition convoy from a compound in a valley that was supposed to be inaccessible. Previous attempts to neutralize him had failed. Drone strikes caused too much collateral damage. Ground assaults were too risky. So they sent Elias. He had moved 3 kilometers through enemy-controlled territory in absolute darkness. No night vision. No support. Just a rifle and the patience of a man who had learned to make himself invisible. He found a position on a cliff face that the tacticians had written off as impossible to reach. And at dawn, when the commander emerged to pray, Elias had taken a shot. 1,800 meters. 1 round. Mission complete. When the extraction team reached him, one of the younger Marines had asked how he did it. How he moved through that terrain without being detected. Vic had answered for him. Like a ghost, Vic said. And when he strikes from above. Like a hawk. Phantom Hawk. The name had stuck. It spread through the special operations community the way legends always spread. Whispered in mess halls and briefing rooms. Studied at training schools. The ghost who struck from above. Elias had never liked the name. He did not think of himself as a legend. He thought of himself as a man who did his job and tried to bring his brothers home alive. He had not always succeeded. The memory shifted, darkened, and suddenly he was in Kandahar province. November 2009. An extraction mission that had gone wrong from the first moment. A helicopter down. 8 wounded operators. Taliban fighters converging from 3 directions. And Vic who saw the interpreter stumbling in the open. Vic who moved before Elias could stop him. Vic who took 2 rounds in the chest, pulling that interpreter to cover. Elias had held the position alone for 6 more hours. He had killed 19 men. He had kept those wounded operators alive until air support finally arrived. When they pulled him off that ridge, he was dehydrated and bleeding from shrapnel in his shoulder, and he was still carrying Vic's body. He had refused to leave him behind. The Navy Cross came later. The Purple Heart. The promotion. None of it mattered. None of it brought Vic back. None of it silenced the voice in his head that said he should have been faster, should have seen the threat, should have taken a shot that would have saved his spotter's life. The last thing Vic had said, blood bubbling on his lips, was not your shot to take, Hawk. Get them home. Elias had gotten them home. All of them except the one who mattered most. The courtroom came back into focus. Judge Ashworth was saying something about reviewing the defendant's prior record. Whitfield was nodding with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had already won. Elias's hand was still pressed against the dog tags beneath his shirt. 2 sets of tags. 1 living, 1 dead, both still serving. He wondered if Vic would be disappointed in what he had become. A man who slept in basements. A man who ate from shelter kitchens. A man who walked the streets of Boston like something less than human. But every morning, no matter where he woke up, Elias made his way to the Massachusetts Veterans Memorial. He found Vic's name on the wall. He traced the letters with his finger, and he whispered the same words he had whispered for 16 years. Still here, brother. Still trying. The fluorescent light buzzed and flickered above him, and Elias Thorne stood in a courtroom that smelled of old paper and dying authority, and he waited for whatever came next. Whitfield adjusted his cufflinks and stepped toward the center of the courtroom with the measured confidence of a man who had never lost a case he cared about winning. He held a slim folder in his left hand, though he did not open it. The folder was a prop, a suggestion of evidence, a tool for theater. Your Honor, he began, let me walk you through exactly what we're dealing with here. On the night of January 14th, building security for the Harrington Industrial Complex on Summer Street, received an alert from motion sensors in the basement level. When they investigated, they found the defendant sleeping behind a heating unit. He had entered through a window that had been improperly secured. He paused to let the image settle. When security personnel asked him to leave, he refused. He stated that it was, and I quote, "too cold to die tonight." Security was forced to physically escort him from the premises. Boston police were called. The defendant was cited and released. Judge Ashworth made a note on her pad. "And the prior incidents?" Whitfield nodded, as though he had been hoping she would ask. October of last year, the defendant was found sleeping in the parking garage of a residential building on Beacon Street. September before that, he was discovered in the storage room of a restaurant on Newberry Street after closing. In each case, he was warned. In each case, he returned to the streets only to trespass again. He turned to face Elias directly. This is not a man who made a single mistake on a cold night. This is a pattern, a choice, a willful decision to take what does not belong to him because he believes the rules do not apply. The public defender stood. "Your Honor, my client has no permanent address. He has struggled to access veteran services due to documentation issues. On the night in question, temperatures dropped to 11 degrees. He was seeking shelter from conditions that could have killed him." Whitfield waved his hand dismissively. Every homeless person in the city faced those same temperatures. Most of them did not break into private property. He stepped closer to the defense table, close enough that Elias could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp. "And let us address this veteran narrative," Whitfield continued. "Counsel claims her client served in the military. Fine. Where's the proof? Where is the DD-214? Where are the service records that would verify these claims?" The public defender shuffled through her papers. "We have submitted a request to the National Personnel Records Center, but processing takes several weeks, and my client's situation is complicated by the loss of his personal documents when he became homeless." Whitfield smiled. "How convenient." He leaned toward Elias, his voice dropping to something that was meant to sound reasonable, but carried an edge of contempt sharp enough to draw blood. "I have to say," he said, "I find it interesting that you can remember to wear those dog tags every single day, but you cannot manage to hold onto a single piece of paper that would prove your service. Almost like the tags are easier to fake than the documents." Elias did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond Whitfield's shoulder, a 1,000-yard stare that the lawyer mistook for emptiness. Deputy Marshal Okafor shifted his weight near the door. His hand had moved unconsciously to rest on his belt, near where his service weapon sat in its holster. Not a threat, just readiness. The posture of a man who sensed something building in the room that others could not feel. Whitfield straightened and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client is not unsympathetic to the plight of the homeless. But sympathy cannot override the law. Property rights must mean something. If we allow people to break into buildings simply because they are cold, we have abandoned the social contract entirely." He gestured at Elias without looking at him. "And I would suggest that the defendant's choice to wear military symbols he almost certainly has no right to wear is itself a form of theft. Stolen valor, taking credit for sacrifices made by real service members who actually earned those honors." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. In the gallery, Clara Mendez adjusted her phone to get a better angle. She had covered hundreds of cases in this courthouse. Petty theft, drug possession, domestic disputes. The machinery of justice grinding through human misery day after day. But something about this one felt different. The old man's stillness, the lawyer's cruelty, the way the deputy marshal kept watching with an expression she could not read. She kept recording. Judge Ashworth removed her glasses and set them on the bench. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I understand your client's position, but I would remind you that accusations of stolen valor are serious and should not be made without evidence." Whitfield nodded. "Of course, Your Honor. I am merely noting the possibility. If the defendant wishes to prove his service, he is welcome to do so. I suspect he cannot." He turned back to Elias. "Can you," he asked, "can you prove Anything you have claimed? For a long moment, Elias said nothing. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Someone in the gallery coughed. The stenographer's fingers hovered motionless above her keys. Then Elias spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent courtroom with a clarity that surprised everyone who heard it. "I do not carry documents, sir," he said. "I lost them when I lost my apartment, when I lost my car, when I lost everything except what I could fit in a bag." Whitfield opened his mouth to respond, but Elias continued. "I have requested replacements from the VA 3 times. Each time, the paperwork was lost or delayed or sent to an address I no longer had. After a while, I stopped trying." He met Whitfield's eyes for the first time. "But I did not stop serving. I served for 34 years. I deployed 11 times. I buried friends whose names are carved into walls that people walk past without reading. And I do not need a piece of paper to know who I am." The silence that followed was absolute. Whitfield recovered quickly. He laughed, a short sound designed to diminish what he had just heard. "A very moving speech," he said. "But speeches are not evidence. Anyone can claim 34 years of service. Anyone can claim 11 deployments. Without documentation, these are just words." He looked at Judge Ashworth. "Your Honor, I move that we proceed with sentencing. The defendant has admitted to the trespassing. His military claims are unverified and irrelevant to the charges." Judge Ashworth studied Elias for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable. "Very well," she said. "But before we proceed, I have a few questions of my own." Judge Ashworth leaned forward, her reading glasses now folded on the bench beside her. She had the look of a woman who had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her that something in this courtroom did not add up. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "you mentioned 34 years of service. What branch?" Elias straightened almost imperceptibly. The movement was automatic, hardwired into his nervous system by decades of responding to authority. "United States Marine Corps, Your Honor," he said. "And your specialty?" "Scout sniper, Your Honor. Later force reconnaissance." The words landed differently than anything else that had been spoken that morning. Deputy Marshal Okafor, still stationed near the door, felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. "Force recon." The words carried weight that civilians could not understand. Weight that Whitfield certainly did not understand, judging by the dismissive smirk that crossed his face. "Force reconnaissance," Whitfield repeated. He let out a small laugh. "Your Honor, this is exactly what I was talking about. Every vagrant with a pair of dog tags claims to have been special forces. It is the most common lie in the homeless community." Judge Ashworth held up a hand to silence him. She kept her eyes on Elias. "Mr. Thorne, can you tell me about your deployments?" Elias was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed. It was still soft, still hoarse, but there was something underneath it now. Something that had been buried for a long time. "I deployed to Iraq in 1991 during Desert Storm," he said. "Then again in 2003 for the initial invasion. I served multiple rotations in Afghanistan between 2004 and 2010. Helmand Province, Kandahar, Kinner Valley." He paused. "The specific operations are classified, Your Honor. I'm not able to discuss them in detail." Whitfield scoffed. "Of course they're classified. How convenient that your service cannot be verified, because it is all secret." But Judge Ashworth was not looking at Whitfield. She was looking at the old man standing before her, at the way his hands had stopped moving entirely, at the way his breathing had slowed. She had seen that stillness before. Her father had come home from Korea with that same quality. The ability to become absolutely motionless when the memories grew too heavy. "Mr. Thorne," she said gently, "you mentioned burying friends. Would you like to tell me about that?" The question seemed to catch Elias off guard. For a moment, his composure flickered. His hand moved toward the tag beneath his shirt, then stopped. "Your Honor," the public defender interjected, "I do not think my client should be required to discuss traumatic experiences as part of a trespassing hearing." Judge Ashworth nodded. "You are right, Counselor. He is not required to. But I am asking." The courtroom waited. Clara Mendez held her phone steady, barely breathing. Even the other defendants in the gallery had stopped shuffling and whispering. Something was happening that they did not fully understand, but they could feel it. A shift in the air. A tightening of invisible threads. Elias looked at the judge for a long moment. Then he reached up and pulled the chain from beneath his shirt. 2 sets of dog tags emerged, dull metal catching the fluorescent light. He held them in his palm, looking down at them as though he had forgotten anyone else was in the room. "These are mine," he said quietly. "Thorn, Elias J., blood type O positive. Catholic." He touched the second set. "These belong to Corporal Vincent Sandoval, my spotter. We served together for 5 years." His thumb traced the letters of the name. "We were in Kandahar province in November 2009. Extraction mission. A helicopter went down with 8 wounded operators aboard. Taliban fighters were converging from multiple directions. Vic and I were in overwatch position on a ridge about 600 meters out. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even Whitfield had stopped smirking. We held that position," Elias continued. "Provided cover fire while the rescue team tried to reach the crash site. But there was an interpreter, a local man who had been helping us. He was wounded, stumbling in the open. The Taliban were going to reach him first." Elias closed his eyes. Vic moved before I could stop him. He broke cover and ran into the open to pull that interpreter to safety. He made it, got the man behind a rock formation. But he took 2 rounds in the chest doing it. His voice cracked slightly, then steadied. I could not go to him. If I left the position, the wounded operators would have been overrun. So I stayed. I watched through my scope while my best friend bled out 50 meters away. And I kept shooting. For 6 more hours, I kept shooting. He opened his eyes and looked at Judge Ashworth. 19 confirmed kills. I kept those operators alive until air support arrived. And when the extraction team finally reached us, I carried Vic's body off that ridge myself. I would not leave him. He held up the second set of tags. "These are his. I have carried them every day for 16 years. Not as a costume, not as a prop, as a promise." The fluorescent light buzzed in the silence. Someone in the gallery was crying quietly. The stenographer had stopped typing, her hands frozen above the keys. Whitfield stood motionless, his folder hanging forgotten at his side. For the first time since the hearing began, he had nothing to say. Deputy Marshal Okafor had moved forward without realizing it. He was close enough now to see the tags clearly, close enough to see the second name. Sandoval Vincenter. He knew that name. Everyone who had served in that theater knew that name. The story of the extraction. The spotter who died saving an interpreter. The sniper who held the ridge alone. Okafor's heart was pounding. His mouth had gone dry. He looked at the old man standing at the defense table, the old man in the donated jacket who slept in basements and ate from shelter kitchens, and he began to understand exactly who he was looking at. Whitfield recovered first. He always did. 20 years of litigation had taught him that momentum was everything, that the lawyer who controlled the narrative controlled the outcome. He could not let a sob story derail his case, no matter how effectively it had been delivered. "Your Honor," he said, stepping forward with renewed energy, "I appreciate the defendant's theatrical abilities. That was a very compelling story, but stories are not evidence." He turned to face the gallery, addressing his words as much to the recording phone as to the judge. "Anyone can memorize dates and locations. Anyone can learn military terminology from the internet. Anyone can buy dog tags with someone else's name on them. What we have not seen is a single piece of verifiable documentation." Judge Ashworth's expression had hardened. "Counselor," she said, "I would advise you to tread carefully." Whitfield spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "I'm simply doing my job, Your Honor. My client has a right to know that the defendant's claims are legitimate before we allow sympathy to override the law." He pointed at Elias without looking at him. "If this man truly served in force reconnaissance, if he truly received commendations for the actions he described, then there should be records. There should be people who can verify his story. The fact that none of this has been produced tells me everything I need to know." The public defender stood. "Your Honor, we have already explained that my client's documentation was lost. The VA has confirmed that his records exist, but retrieval has been delayed due to bureaucratic backlog. Whitfield shook his head. Convenient delays. Missing paperwork. Classified operations that cannot be discussed. Do you see the pattern here, Your Honor? Every time we ask for proof, there is an excuse. He stepped closer to the defense table, close enough to invade Elias's space, close enough to make his physical presence felt. Let me ask you directly, he said to Elias. If your service was so distinguished, where are your medals? Where's your uniform? Where are the brothers in arms who would vouch for you? Elias looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only exhaustion. I pawned my medals in 2014 to pay for a motel room, he said quietly. My uniform was in a storage unit that I lost when I could not pay the fees. And my brothers in arms are either dead or scattered, and I have not had a phone or an address to reach them in 11 years. Whitfield smiled, sensing blood in the water. So you have nothing. No proof. No weaknesses. Just a sad story and a pair of dog tags that could have come from anywhere. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I move that we disregard the defendant's unverified claims and proceed with sentencing based on the facts of the case. The defendant has admitted to trespassing. He has a documented history of similar offenses. The only question is what consequences will finally teach him to respect the property of others. But something had shifted in the courtroom while Whitfield was speaking. Deputy Marshal Okafor had moved from his position near the door. He was standing now, just behind the gallery, his eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that had nothing to do with security protocols. The story Elias had told was one Okafor had heard before. Not the personal details, not the names, but the outline. The extraction gone wrong. The ridge held alone. The sniper who would not leave his spotter's body behind. It was legend. It was the kind of story that got passed around barracks and briefing rooms, growing larger with each telling until no one quite believed it anymore. A ghost story for Marines who needed to believe that one man could hold back the darkness. Okafor studied the old man at the defense table. The way he held himself, even now, even after everything. The slight tremor in his left hand that spoke of old injuries. The scar that ran from his temple into his hairline, barely visible beneath the silver hair. He remembered something else from his stories. The sniper had a call sign, a name that had become synonymous with impossible shots and silent movement. A name that young Marines whispered when they wanted to invoke something larger than themselves. Okafor needed to know. Your Honor, Whitfield was saying, the law is clear. Trespassing is a crime regardless of the defendant's personal circumstances. If we make exceptions for everyone with a tragic backstory, the entire system collapses. Judge Ashworth held up her hand. I have heard your argument, counselor. Several times now. She looked at Elias again. There was something in her expression that had not been there at the start of the hearing. Not quite sympathy. Something more complicated than that. Mr. Thorne, she said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that you're under no obligation to answer. Elias nodded. The judge leaned forward slightly. In your years of service, did you have a call sign? The question hung in the air. Whitfield opened his mouth to object, but something made him stop. Perhaps it was the sudden stillness that had fallen over the courtroom. Perhaps it was the way Deputy Marshal Okafor had gone rigid near the gallery. Perhaps it was some instinct warning him that he was standing at the edge of something he did not understand. Elias was silent for a long moment. His hand moved again to the tags beneath his shirt, a gesture so automatic he did not seem aware he was making it. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, Your Honor, he said. I had a call sign. Judge Ashworth waited. Elias lifted his eyes to meet hers. They called me Phantom Hawk. The name fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Phantom Hawk. 2 words that meant nothing to most of the people in the courtroom. 2 words that meant everything to Deputy Marshal Terrence Okafor. His legs went weak beneath him. He grabbed the back of a gallery bench to steady himself, his knuckles going white against the wood. The blood had drained from his face so quickly that a woman seated nearby asked if he was all right. He did not answer her. Phantom Hawk. He had heard that name for the first time in a bunker in Fallujah, 2005. A gunnery sergeant with 3 combat tours had been telling stories to keep the younger Marines calm during a mortar attack. Stories about the operators who moved through the darkness like something not quite human. Stories about the sniper who never missed. They say he once made a shot at 1,800 meters in a crosswind that should have been impossible, the gunnery sergeant had said. Dropped the Taliban commander who thought he was untouchable. No spate, no support, just him and his rifle and patience that would outlast God himself. The younger Marines had laughed nervously, thinking it was exaggeration, the kind of legend that grew in the telling. But the gunnery sergeant had not been smiling. I served with a man who saw him once, he had said. Just a glimpse. Said he moved through hostile territory like he was made of shadow. Said when he took a shot, the sound came after the target was already falling. Like a hawk striking from above before you even knew it was there. Phantom hawk. Okafor stared at the old man, standing at the defense table. The donated jacket, the silver beard, the weather hands. This was not what a legend was supposed to look like. Legends were supposed to be tall and strong and untouchable. They were not supposed to end up sleeping in basements, eating from shelter kitchens, standing trial for trying to survive a winter night. But the eyes, the stillness, the way he held himself, even now, even after everything that had been taken from him. Okafor believed. Whitfield, oblivious to what was unfolding behind him, let out a sharp laugh. Phantom hawk, he repeated. Was that some kind of video game character? Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of fantasy I was warning you about. The defendant is clearly delusional. Judge Ashworth did not respond to him. She was watching Deputy Marshal Okafor, who had taken another step forward, who was staring at the defendant with an expression she had never seen on his face in 15 years of working in her courtroom. Marshal Okafor, she said carefully, is there something you would like to add? Okafor's voice came out rough, like something was caught in his throat. Your Honor, he said, I need to ask the defendant a question. With your permission. Whitfield spun around. This is completely irregular. A court officer cannot participate in proceedings. Judge Ashworth held up her hand to silence him. She studied Okafor for a long moment, then nodded. Go ahead, Marshal. Okafor stepped forward until he was standing in the aisle between the gallery and the council tables. He was close enough now to see the details he had missed before. The scar at the temple, the slight favoring of the left shoulder that spoke of old damage, the tattoo just visible at the edge of the sleeve where the donated jacket had written up. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The extraction in Kandahar, he said. November 2009. The helicopter that went down. Elias turned to look at him. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. What was the call sign of the rescue operation? Okafor asked. The one that finally got you out. The question was a test. The kind of detail that would not be in any public record. The kind of thing only someone who had been there or who had been briefed on a classified after-action report would know. Elias studied him, took in the marshal's uniform, the posture that spoke of military service, the desperate hope in his eyes. Operation Broken Arrow, Elias said quietly. They called it that because of the downbird, but the actual extraction was designated Valkyrie 6. Okafor's breath left him in a rush. He had read that report years ago when he was still active duty, when a commanding officer had used it as a training example. The official designation had been Valkyrie 6. That detail had never been made public. He looked at the old man in the donated jacket, the man who slept in basements and carried his dead friend's dog tags, and he felt something crack open in his chest. Oh my God, he whispered. It is really you. He turned to Judge Ashworth, and when he spoke again, his voice was shaking. Your Honor, he said, I serve in the Marines. Iraq, 2004 to 2006. I know what these operations were. I know what this man did. He pointed at Elias with a hand that trembled. If this is who I think it is, he said, then you're looking at one of the most decorated snipers in the history of force reconnaissance. The operation he described is real. It is classified, but it is real. And the man who held that ridge, the man who carried his spotter's body off that mountain, he was awarded the Navy Cross. His voice broke. Your Honor, Phantom Hawk is not a fantasy. He is a legend, and he is standing right in front of you. The courtroom had frozen. Every person in the gallery sat motionless, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever was happening. Clara Mendez held her phone with both hands now, her arms trembling slightly from the effort of keeping it steady. She had covered this courthouse for 6 years. She had never seen anything like this. Whitfield stood in the center of the room with his mouth open, no words coming out. His carefully constructed narrative was crumbling around him, and for the first time in his career, he did not know how to rebuild it. Judge Ashworth leaned back in her chair. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were gripping the edge of the bench. "Marshal Okafor," she said slowly, "are you certain about what you were saying?" Okafor nodded. He had not taken his eyes off Elias. "Your Honor, I read the after-action report on that extraction when I was stationed at Camp Lejeune. My commanding officer used it as a training example. The details match exactly. The downed helicopter, the wounded operators, the sniper who held the ridge alone for 6 hours after his spotter was killed." He swallowed hard. "There were 19 confirmed kills that day, Your Honor, from a single position, in conditions that should have been impossible. They wrote papers about it. They studied it at Quantico. The man who did that was a ghost. He was a legend." He turned to look at Whitfield, and there was something cold in his eyes. "And you just accused him of stealing valor." Whitfield found his voice. "This is absurd. This is one man's opinion based on a story. There is still no documentation, no official verification." But his voice had lost its power. The theatrical confidence that had carried him through the morning was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. Judge Ashworth raised her hand for silence. She looked at Elias, who had not moved, who had not reacted to any of it. He stood at the defense table with the same quiet dignity he had shown since the beginning, as though none of this touched him. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "the tattoo on your forearm. Marshal Okafor mentioned seeing it. Would you be willing to show it to the court?" Elias hesitated. His hand moved to his sleeve, fingers resting on the fabric. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse, like he might simply accept whatever judgment came and walk back out into the cold streets that had been his home for so long. But then something shifted in his expression. A decision made, a wall coming down. He rolled up his sleeve. The tattoo covered most of his left forearm. It was faded with age, the lines softened by years of sun and weather, but every detail was still visible. At the center was the Force Reconnaissance Eagle, wings spread wide, talons extended. Beneath it, a set of coordinates: 31.6225 degrees north, 65.7372 degrees east. A date: 111-42009. And at the bottom, 2 letters that seemed to carry more weight than everything else combined. V is Vincent Sandoval. Okafor made a sound that might have been a sob. He turned away, one hand pressed to his face. In the gallery, one of the other defendants, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and a faded army jacket, slowly rose to his feet. He did not say anything. He simply stood at attention, his hand lifting to his brow in a salute. Another man stood, then another. 3 veterans who had been waiting for their own cases, who had been sitting in silence, now standing in tribute to something they recognized, something that transcended the walls of this courtroom. Whitfield watched it happen with growing horror. His case was collapsing. His reputation was collapsing. Everything he had built this morning was turning to ash. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking, "this is highly irregular. These proceedings have become a circus. I demand a recess." Judge Ashworth ignored him. She was staring at the tattoo on Elias's forearm, at the coordinates that marked a place on the other side of the world where a man had held back the darkness alone. "Those coordinates," she said quietly. "That is where it happened." Elias nodded. His voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it now, something that had been locked away for a very long time. "That is where Vic died," he said. "That is where I failed him." Okafor spun around. Failed him? He crossed the remaining distance between them, stopping just in front of the defense table. His eyes were wet. "You held that position for 6 hours," he said. "You killed 19 enemy fighters. You kept 8 wounded operators alive until extraction. How can you say you failed?" Elias looked at him with eyes that held 16 years of grief. Because he is dead, he said simply. Because I watched him bleed out through my scope, and I could not do anything to stop it. Because he should be here, and I should be the one carved into that wall. The silence that followed was the deepest the courtroom had ever known. Judge Ashworth removed her glasses and set them down. When she spoke, her voice was thick. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I believe you had some concerns about the authenticity of the defendant's service." She looked at the lawyer with an expression that could have frozen steel. "Do you have any further objections?" Whitfield stood paralyzed in the center of the courtroom. The gallery behind him had transformed into something he did not recognize. 3 veterans standing at attention, saluting a homeless man. A deputy marshal with tears streaming down his face. A judge looking at him like he was something she had found on the bottom of her shoe. His mouth opened and closed. The silver cufflinks that had gleamed with such confidence an hour ago now felt like weights dragging him down. "Your Honor," he managed, "I was simply doing my job. I had no way of knowing." Judge Ashworth cut him off. "No way of knowing?" She leaned forward, and her voice carried the weight of 25 years on the bench. "You stood in my courtroom and accused a decorated combat veteran of stolen valor. You mocked his service. You called his dog tags a costume. You suggested he was a liar and a fraud." She pointed at Elias. "This man served his country for 34 years. He held a position alone for 6 hours while his best friend bled to death 50 meters away. He received the Navy Cross for actions that most people could not even imagine. And you, Counselor, you could not be bothered to consider for one moment that he might be telling the truth." Whitfield's face had gone gray. "Your Honor, I apologize. I was overzealous. I will withdraw my comments about the defendant's service record." "You will do more than that," Judge Ashworth said. "You will stand there and listen." She turned to Elias. "Mr. Thorne, I want you to understand something. What happened here today, the way you were treated, it is a failure. A failure of this court. A failure of the system that should have protected you. A failure of all of us." Her voice softened. "You served this country with honor. You sacrificed more than most people will ever understand. And in return, you were left to sleep in basements and fight for your survival in a city that should have been grateful for your existence." She paused, composing herself. "The charges against you are dismissed, fully and permanently." The public defender let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for an hour. Elias showed no reaction. He simply stood there, the same quiet dignity he had carried since the moment he walked in. But Judge Ashworth was not finished. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, turning back to the lawyer, "I am referring your conduct in this case to the Massachusetts Bar Association for review. Your treatment of the defendant was not just unprofessional. It was cruel, and I will not have cruelty in my courtroom." Whitfield opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. His client's representative, the property manager who had been checking his watch all morning, was already edging toward the door, wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. Furthermore, Judge Ashworth continued, "I am ordering a review of the defendant's VA claims. Whatever bureaucratic obstacles have prevented Mr. Thorne from accessing the benefits he earned, those obstacles will be removed. I will personally contact the regional VA director this afternoon." She looked at Elias. "You should never have been in this courtroom, Mr. Thorne, not as a defendant. The only reason you should ever stand before a judge is to be thanked for your service." For the first time since the hearing began, something shifted in Elias's expression. A crack in the armor, a glimpse of the man underneath. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rough, "I do not need thanks. I just needed to survive the night." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Not of the court, not of Whitfield, but of everything. Of a country that sent men to war and then forgot them. Of a system that lost paperwork while veterans lost their homes. Of a city that walked past its heroes every day without seeing them. Judge Ashworth nodded slowly. "I understand," she said, "but you're going to get more than survival, Mr. Thorne. You're going to get what you deserve." She looked at Deputy Marshal Okafor. "Marshal, please escort Mr. Thorne to my chambers when we adjourn. I want to make some phone calls before he leaves this building." Okafor straightened. "Yes, Your Honor." He moved to stand beside Elias, not as a guard, but as something else entirely. A brother. a fellow Marine, someone who understood. In the gallery, Clara Mendez lowered her phone. Her hands were shaking. She had captured everything. The accusations, the revelation, the standing salutes, the tears. She did not know yet that her footage would be viewed 4 million times in the first 24 hours. She did not know that it would trend nationally, that news networks would pick it up, that the hashtag Justice for Phantom Hawk would become a rallying cry for veterans across the country. All she knew was that she had witnessed something extraordinary, something that reminded her why she had become a journalist in the first place. Whitfield remained frozen in the center of the courtroom, his career unraveling around him in real time. The other defendants in the gallery were staring at him with undisguised contempt. The stenographer had stopped typing and was simply watching, her expression unreadable. He had come into this room believing he was the most powerful person in it. He was leaving as something else entirely. A cautionarità, a villain in a story that was only beginning to spread. The courtroom began to empty slowly, as though no one quite wanted to leave. The other defendants filed out with backward glances at the old man, still standing at the defense table. The property manager had already disappeared, wanting no association with the disaster his lawyer had created. The stenographer gathered her equipment with trembling hands. Whitfield remained rooted to his spot. His legs did not seem to want to carry him. When he finally moved, it was with the shuffling gait of a man who had aged 20 years in 40 minutes. He did not look at Elias as he passed. He could not. The door closed behind him with a sound like a verdict. Judge Ashworth rose from the bench. "Court is in recess," she said, though there was no one left to hear it but Elias, his public defender, Deputy Marshal Okafor, and Clara Mendez, who was still seated in the gallery, still processing what she had witnessed. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, "if you will follow Marshal Okafor to my chambers, I would like to speak with you privately." Elias nodded. The public defender began gathering her files, her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you," she said to the judge, "for listening." Judge Ashworth looked at her for a long moment. "I should have listened sooner. We all should have." She stepped down from the bench and disappeared through the door behind it. Okafor moved to Elias's side. "This way," he said quietly. And then, after a pause, Gunnery Sergeant. The rank hung in the air between them. Elias had not been addressed by his rank in over a decade. The sound of it brought something up from deep inside him, something he had tried to bury along with everything else. He followed Okafor through a side door and down a corridor lined with portraits of former judges. Their eyes seemed to watch him pass, these men and women who had spent their lives deciding the fates of others. He wondered how many homeless veterans had stood before them. He wondered how many had been believed. The judges' chambers were smaller than he expected. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes and framed photographs. A window looked out over the city, gray winter light filtering through the glass. Judge Ashworth stood behind her desk, a phone pressed to her ear. "Yes," she was saying. "Thorne, Elias J., Gunnery Sergeant, retired. Force reconnaissance. I need his complete service record pulled and verified within the hour." She paused, listening. "I understand that is not standard procedure. I'm making it standard procedure. This man was nearly sentenced in my courtroom while wearing a Navy cross around his neck. Whatever it takes, make it happen." She hung up and looked at Elias. "Please," she said, gesturing to a chair. "Seat." Elias hesitated. He had not sat in a chair this comfortable in years. The shelters had hard plastic seats. The streets had concrete and cardboard. This leather chair, with its padded arms and soft cushion, felt like something from another lifetime. He sat. Okafor stood by the door, at parade rest, as though guarding something precious. Judge Ashworth settled into her own chair and studied Elias for a long moment. Her expression had changed from the stern authority she wore on the bench. There was something softer there now, something almost like grief. "My father served in Korea," she said. "He never talked about it. Not once in 40 years. But I remember the way he held himself. The way he could go still in a room full of noise. The way his eyes sometimes looked at something no one else could see." She paused. "I saw that in you the moment you walked into my courtroom. I should have trusted what I saw." Elias shook his head slowly. You had no reason to believe me, Your Honor. I look like what I am. A man who gave up. You look like a man who was abandoned, she corrected. There's a difference. The phone on her desk rang. She answered it, listened for a moment, and her expression shifted. Already, she said. How many views? She listened again, then hung up. Marshal Okafor, she said, it seems the footage from this morning's hearing has been uploaded to the internet. It has been viewed over 100,000 times in the last 20 minutes. Okafor's eyebrows rose. That was fast. Clara Mendez, Judge Ashworth said. The journalist in the gallery. She posted it to her social media accounts the moment she left the courtroom. She looked at Elias. Mr. Thorne, I suspect your life is about to change significantly. The question is whether you are ready for that. Elias stared at her. He did not understand what she was telling him. Footage, views, social media. These were words from a world he had left behind years ago. A world that had left him behind. I do not know what that means, Your Honor, he said honestly. Judge Ashworth leaned forward. It means people are going to know your name, she said. It means people are going to want to help you. And it means you're going to have to decide whether to let them. She held his gaze. The hardest part of surviving is not the cold or the hunger. It is learning to accept that you deserve to come in from both. Are you ready for that, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne? Elias did not answer. He looked down at his hands, scarred and weathered, hands that had held a rifle steady for 6 hours while his best friend died. He did not know if he was ready. He did not know if he ever would be. The video spread like wildfire through dry brush. By noon, it had crossed 500,000 views. By evening, it was over 2 million. News networks picked it up before sunset, running segments with titles like Homeless Veteran Silences Courtroom and The Legend They Forgot. Clara Mendez's phone had not stopped ringing since she posted the footage. Requests pouring in from producers and journalists who wanted interviews, who wanted the full story, who wanted to be part of what was quickly becoming a national moment. The hashtag Justice for Phantom Hawk began trending before dinner. Veterans organizations mobilized within hours. The American Legion issued a statement condemning the treatment Elias had received. The Veterans of Foreign Wars announced they were launching an investigation into how a decorated Force Recon Marine had fallen through every safety net the system was supposed to provide. A congressman from Massachusetts, himself a former Army captain, stood on the floor of the House and demanded answers. Nathan Whitfield resigned from his law firm by the end of the day. His partners had watched the video in stunned silence, then asked for his resignation before the evening news cycle could bury them alongside him. He would later be suspended by the Bar Association pending a full review of his conduct. His name would become synonymous with everything wrong about how society treated its forgotten heroes. But Elias knew none of this. He sat in Judge Ashworth's chambers as the afternoon light faded through the window, watching the city he had wandered for years turn gold and then gray. Okafor had brought him coffee from somewhere, real coffee in a ceramic mug, and Elias held it between his hands like something precious. The warmth seeped into his palms, into his bones, into places that had been cold for so long he had forgotten what warmth felt like. Judge Ashworth had made more calls. To the VA regional director, who promised expedited processing of all outstanding claims. To a veterans housing organization, who confirmed they had a bed available that night. To a contact at the Department of Defense, who was already pulling Elias's classified service records for official verification. The wheels were turning. The system that had failed him was suddenly, frantically, trying to make amends. But Elias sat in silence, staring at the coffee in his hands, and he felt nothing. Or rather, he felt too much. A flood of emotion that he had spent 16 years building dams against, and now those dams were cracking. Every kindness he received felt like a blade. Every offer of help felt like an accusation. You survived, the voices whispered. Victor not. What give you the right? Okafor sat across from him, waiting. He had not spoken in nearly an hour. He understood, in a way that only someone who had served could understand, that some silences needed to be honored. Finally, Elias spoke. I do not know how to do this, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. I do not know how to be a person again. Okafor leaned forward. Nobody does it first, he said. You think any of us came back and just slotted into normal life? You think there's a switch you flip? He shook his head. It is a process, Gunnery Sergeant. 1 day at a time. 1 hour at a time. Sometimes 1 minute at a time. But you do not have to do it alone. That is what you have not figured out yet. You have been carrying this by yourself for so long you forgot that there are people who want to help carry it with you. Elias looked at him. Why? Why what? Why do you care? You do not know me. None of these people know me. I'm just a story to them. A video on the internet. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it and removed a photograph, creased and faded, and handed it across. Elias looked at it. A group of young Marines in desert camouflage, arms around each other, grinning at the camera. 8 faces. 8 brothers. That was my squad in Fallujah, Okafor said. 2005. We had just survived a firefight that should have killed all of us. He pointed to the faces one by one. Thompson, killed by an IED 6 months later. Rodriguez, took his own life in 2012. Peterson, overdose, 2018. Kowalski, homeless for 3 years before someone found him dead under an overpass. His voice cracked. Half of them are gone now, and every single one of them was abandoned by the same system that abandoned you. They fell through the cracks because nobody was paying attention, because nobody cared enough to catch them. He looked at Elias with eyes that held 16 years of grief. You want to know why I care? Because I cannot save them, but maybe I can help save you. Maybe that is why I was in that courtroom today. Maybe that is why I recognized the name. He leaned back. You are not just a story, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. You are a second chance. Mine and yours. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had been said and everything that could never be put into words. Elias looked down at the photograph in his hands. 8 young faces. 4 of them dead now. And this man, this stranger who wore a marshal's uniform, sitting across from him with tears in his eyes, asking for the chance to help. He did not know if he deserved a second chance. But for the first time in 16 years, he wondered if he might be willing to find out. The first night was the hardest. The Veterans Housing Facility was a converted warehouse in South Boston, renovated with donated funds and volunteer labor into something that resembled dignity. Individual rooms instead of open barracks. Real beds with clean sheets. A communal kitchen where residents could cook their own meals if they wanted, or eat together in a dining hall if they needed the company. Elias stood in the doorway of his assigned room and could not make himself enter. It was small. A single bed against one wall, a dresser, a window that looked out over a parking lot. Nothing fancy, nothing special, but it was his. A space with a door that locked, where no one would tell him to move along, where no one would look at him like he was something to be stepped over. He had not had a room of his own in 11 years. Okafor stood behind him in the hallway. Take your time, he said. There is no rush. Elias stepped inside. The floor creaked under his weight. The bed was made with military corners, and the sight of it sent a wave of memory crashing through him. Basic training. The barracks. The first time he had learned to make a bed that could pass inspection. He sat down on the edge of the mattress. The springs gave slightly beneath him. He could not remember the last time he had sat on something soft. I will be back tomorrow, Okafor said from the doorway. There are people who want to meet you. People who can help with the VA paperwork, with getting your record sorted out, with whatever you need. He paused. But tonight, just rest. You have earned that much. He closed the door, and Elias was alone. The silence was deafening. On the streets, there was always noise. Traffic, voices, the constant hum of a city that never slept. In the shelters, there were coughs and snores and the shuffle of bodies in the dark. But here, in this small room with its clean sheets and its locked door, there was nothing. Elias sat on the bed and listened to his own breathing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the battered field guide to birds that Vic had carried through 3 deployments. The cover was worn soft with handling. The pages were stained with dirt and sweat, and, in one corner, something that might have been blood. He had carried it for 16 years, pulling it out in quiet moments, reading the same entries over and over. He opened it to a random page. The peregrine falcon, fastest animal on Earth. can dive at speeds over 240 miles per hour. Vic had loved the peregrine, said it was the perfect predator, said if he came back in another life, that was what he wanted to be. Elias ran his fingers over the words. His vision blurred. I do not know if I can do this, he said aloud. His voice sounded strange in the empty room. Rusty. Broken. He was not talking to himself. He was talking to Vic. The way he had talked to Vic every day for 16 years at the memorial under bridges in the quiet hours before dawn. I do not know if I deserve this, he continued. A bed. A room. People who want to help. You should be the one sitting here. You should be the one who made it. The silence offered no answer. Elias closed the book and pressed it against his chest. He could feel his heart beating beneath it, steady and stubborn, still pumping blood through a body that had survived everything the world had thrown at it. You told me to get them home, he whispered. You told me it was not my shot to take. But you never told me how to live with being the one who walked away. He lay back on the bed, still holding the book. The ceiling above him was white and blank, unmarked by the water stains and mold he had grown accustomed to. A clean ceiling. A small miracle. Somewhere outside, a car horn honked. A dog barked. The city moved on, indifferent to the man lying in a room he did not yet believe he deserved. Elias closed his eyes. For the first time in 11 years, he slept in a bed. For the first time in 16 years, he did not dream of the ridge, of the blood, of the sound of Vic's last breath rattling in his chest. He dreamed instead of birds, falcons and hawks and eagles, soaring on thermals above a world that could not touch them. And somewhere among them, a young man with an easy smile, pointing at the sky and naming each one. When Elias woke in the morning, his face was wet with tears he did not remember crying. But he was still there, still breathing, still trying. The first step had been taken. There would be others. There would be setbacks and hard days and moments when the darkness seemed ready to swallow him whole. But for now, in this small room with its clean sheets and its locked door, Elias Thorne had done something he had not done in 16 years. He had let someone help him, and that was enough to build on. 6 weeks later, Elias stood at the front of a room filled with strangers who understood him better than anyone else alive. The Second Watch program met every Thursday evening in a converted warehouse near the harbor. Folding chairs arranged in a circle. Coffee brewing in the corner. No paperwork, no bureaucracy, no pressure. Just veterans helping veterans find their way back from the edge. Margaret Riley, who everyone called Mags, had founded the program after her own brother took his life in 2016. She was a Navy veteran herself, compact and fierce, with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had reached out to Elias 3 days after the Courtroom video went viral, showing up at the housing facility with a thermos of coffee and an offer. No strings, she had said. You show up or you do not. The door stays open either way. Elias had shown up. That first night, he sat in the back and said nothing. The second week, the same. The third week, he moved 1 row closer to the circle. By the 4th week, he was sitting with the others, still silent, but present. Tonight was different. Mags had asked him if he was ready to share. Not his whole story, just whatever he could manage. He had nodded, though his hands were shaking. Now he stood in front of 15 veterans, men and women who carried their own invisible wounds, and he opened his mouth to speak. My name is Elias, he said. His voice was steadier than he expected. Call sign was Phantom Hawk. I was Force Recon for 22 years. I lost my best friend in Kandahar because I could not move fast enough to cover him. He paused. The room was silent. No one shifted. No one looked away. I spent 16 years believing I did not deserve to be alive, he continued. I slept under bridges. I ate from shelter kitchens. I walked past people every day who looked right through me like I was already a ghost. His hand moved to the dog tags beneath his shirt. I thought I was honoring Vic by punishing myself. I thought suffering was the least I owed him. But I was wrong. He looked around the circle at the faces watching him. A young woman with burn scars on her neck. An older man missing 2 fingers on his left hand. A kid who could not have been more than 25, with the hollow eyes of someone who had seen too much too soon. Surviving is not betraying the dead, Elias said. It took me 16 years to understand that. Surviving is how we honor them. By living. By helping others live. By refusing to let the darkness win. He swallowed hard. Vic told me to get them home. His last words. Get them home. And for 16 years, I thought I had failed because I could not get him home. But maybe that is not what he meant. Maybe home is not a place. Maybe home is still being here. Still trying. Still showing up for the people who need you. He looked at Mags, who was watching him with tears streaming silently down her face. I'm still here, he said. And if I can come back from where I was, so can you. Any of you. All of you. He sat down. The silence held for a long moment. Then the young woman with the burn scars began to clap. Others joined. Not applause for a performance, but recognition. Acknowledgement. Welcome. After the meeting, Elias walked to the Massachusetts Veterans Memorial. The night was cold, but he barely felt it. His new jacket, donated by a veterans organization that had reached out after the video, kept the wind at bay. He found Vic's name on the wall, the same spot he had visited every day for 16 years. He traced the letters with his finger. Still here, brother, he said softly. Still trying. We got 4 new people into housing this month. 2 of them are already working. 1 is going back to school. He pulled out the bird guide and opened it to the page about peregrine falcons. Mag says, I have a gift for reaching people. He continued. Says I should think about training to be a counselor. Can you imagine? Me, helping people talk about their feelings. He almost smiled. You would laugh at that. You would say something about hawks not being known for their emotional intelligence. He closed the book and pressed it against his chest. I'm going to keep showing up, Vic. Every day. For as long as I have. That is the promise I am making you now. Not to suffer. Not to punish myself. To live. To help others live. That is how I honor you. He stood there for a long moment, the cold wind cutting across the memorial plaza, the names of the fallen gleaming in the dim light of the street lamps. Then he turned and walked back toward the housing facility, toward the room that was his, toward the life that was slowly, painfully, miraculously becoming his again. Behind him, a young veteran stood at the edge of the plaza, watching. He had seen the video. He had recognized the old man. He had been standing in this spot for an hour, trying to work up the courage to speak. Elias noticed him as he passed, stopped, studied the young man's face, the hollow eyes, the rigid posture of someone holding himself together by force of will. First time here, Elias asked. The young man nodded. He could not seem to find words. Elias walked over to him, stood beside him, looking at the wall of names. Come on, he said. I will show you around. They walked together into the night, 2 veterans carrying wounds that would never fully heal, finding their way forward one step at a time. And somewhere, on a ridge in Kandahar that existed now only in memory, a young man with an easy smile watched them go. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that healing is possible and that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected forms, please subscribe to our channel. And tell us in the comments, who is the quiet hero in your life who deserves recognition? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still in uniform. They're the ones who keep showing up, keep fighting, keep choosing to live even when the darkness feels overwhelming. Thank you for watching. And remember, every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary.